Okay, this is the video lecture for Chapter 7, talking about the structure of the executive branch and its various agencies. So let's get right into it. This is the org chart for the government of the United States that you can find very easily on the internet. And let's look at the executive branch in comparison to these other branches that we've talked about or will talk about. Here is the box for the legislative branch and its various agencies that work for the Congress. Over here is the various agencies that work for the judicial branch headed by the Supreme Court. But then, as you can see, everything else on this entire chart represents the executive branch. Here's the inner office of the president called the executive office. We'll talk about that here in a minute. Here are your cabinet level departments right here. We've got 15 cabinet level departments, which are very importantly overseeing these various sectors of American society, whether it's the Defense, Department of Commerce, Department of Agriculture, Department of Education. What we'll do here in a few minutes is look at each one of, well, most of all of these cabinet level departments and look at their org charts and see how they're structured and talk about most importantly, the agencies that do the bulk of the work for these departments. And then down here also a part of the executive branch are all the independent agencies. And there's several different types of independent agencies that we're going to talk about that will give you a better, more clear understanding of what the executive branch is made up of. Over 3 million employees make up the executive branch and responsible for delivering lots of public goods and lots of public services, lots of rules and regulations and things that we'll talk about. Let's talk for just a minute here about the executive office of the president. And you may have heard of, these are inner office advisors directly to the president that he selects to advise him on various affairs, such as the Council of Economic Advisors, the Office of the Trade Representative, talking about our role in the world as far as trading. Very importantly, I'll look at this one here in a minute, the National Security Council, which advises the president on conflicts around the world or potentials for conflict or protection of the United States and our security. Office of Management and Budget does a lot of the work on proposed budgets and spending, things like that. You may have heard of some of these others here, but this is the inner office that advises the president, called the Executive Office. So let's look at the National Security Council. These are the advisors that meet with the president fairly regularly on security affairs, conflict around the world, protection of our society. Vice President sits in on that. There's other people that sit in on this meeting from time to time. These are the general mainstays that sit in on these meetings. And we have 3 of the most important cabinet departments that sit on it: Secretaries of State, Treasury, and Defense. The National Security Advisor, very importantly, is the man that's got the president's ear on advising him on how to pursue on our national security. And that position has been somewhat in the news lately because of the original appointee decided to resign. And then so some of these positions are still being filled as we speak by the new Trump administration. The chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staffs, we'll look at that position again here in a minute. That person is the head of all 3 of the military departments, Army, Navy, and Air Force, reports directly to the president in this particular council. The Director of National Intelligence is a relatively new position that was established after 9/11 in order to try to coordinate 17 different agencies that have certain responsibilities in gathering intelligence. So it was a very kind of mishmash of intelligence that was coming in and from very different sources and different agencies. So in order to try to coordinate that after 9/11, the Director of National Intelligence was created to serve as the coordinator for these, even though he may not specifically be over some of those agencies, such as the CIA or the Department of Homeland Security or FBI, which are all in different agencies. But he is the one that is the focal point for coordinating it, and getting it to the president. So then the Chief of Staff of the White House and the President's Council, also members of that National Security Council. Okay, so first of all, let's talk generally about the four basic types of organizations in the executive branch that we're going to be looking at. First of all, we're going to be looking at the cabinet departments. As I said, there's 15 of those, and they're all headed by a particular secretary of, whether it's Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Agriculture. And most importantly, what we'll see is that in each one of these cabinets, there are a group of third-tier bureaus. These are the groups or the agencies that you may have heard of that do the bulk of the work of providing the services for government on those particular cabinets. Now, we'll also look at independent agencies and talk primarily about the reason why they are independent from other agencies, such as NASA, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, CIA. We'll talk about those here in a few minutes. Another type of organization in the executive branch are government corporations. So we'll explain what those are, why they're called government corporations, and here's some examples of some government corporations that we'll be talking about here in a few minutes. And then the fourth type of organization are the regulatory commissions, such as the Federal Trade Commission, Federal Communications Commission, that sort of thing. They are responsible for regulating these various sectors of our society and why they may need to do that. So let's first of all get into some examples of the cabinet departments. Here's the 15 cabinet departments. We'll look at several of these and look at their org charts for each one, their structure of how they're organized, and talk about their third-tier bureaus. Here's the U.S. Department of Transportation and its org chart, headed by the Secretary of Transportation. Now, as you'll see in each one of these org charts, you've got several offices. These are administrative offices and assistant secretaries and undersecretaries. Those are largely administrative functions, but in each one of these what we'll have is called the third tier bureau, and I'll highlight it here with the red box. These are the third tier bureaus of the Department of Transportation, and you have certainly heard of some of these. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, very important in its responsibility in regulating our air traffic control and our airports. We also have the Federal Highway Administration here, that is important for the regulating our highway system. We also have, along with that, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which is looking at how to make our highways safer, regulating that. And so those are some very important third-tier bureaus in the Department of Transportation. Now, the heading got cut off here, but as you can see fairly quickly, this is the Department of Health and Human Services. Their structure is not necessarily a vertical one, but over here you've got your offices and your administrative assistants and all that kind of stuff. So let's look at the third tier bureaus, which is this section right here in the middle. And you've clearly have heard of some of these. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, very important in trying to figure out certain types of threats from diseases. It often coordinates with the World Health Organization to prevent epidemics from getting into America. The Food and Drug Administration, very important. It provides the approvals for new pharmaceuticals and food safety and labeling and things like that. The National Institutes of Health is a very important agency that does a lot of studies and recommendations on how our public can be more healthy and things like that to save money on health costs or to have a healthier life. And this one is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, two very expensive programs in our government, and this the agency that coordinates Medicare and Medicaid systems. So you have heard of a few of those. Now let's look at the Department of Justice. Now the head of this department is not called the Secretary of Justice. As you may have already surmised, this is the Attorney General who heads this department, the top law enforcement officer in the United States. And again, we have several undersecretaries and administrative offices here, but let's focus on their third-tier bureaus. And there they are right there. And clearly you've heard of some of these, famously the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, which coordinates crimes across the country. We also have the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, is under the Department of Justice. Have the Bureau of Prisons. We have the U.S. Marshal Service, which has various functions, one of which may be hunting for fugitives, as Tommy Lee Jones did in that very famous movie, tracking down Richard Kimball, played by Harrison Ford. We also have the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives in this group right here. And each state is assigned a U.S. attorney by the federal government to coordinate legal affairs with the state and the federal government. In fact, the U.S. attorney, the former U.S. attorney for New Jersey, is now Governor Chris Christie. He was appointed by President George W. Bush to be U.S. attorney for the state of New Jersey, got fairly high marks for his job, and made a name for himself and ran for governor. So these are some of the third-tier bureaus for the Department of Justice. Now, the Department of Homeland Security was created after 9/11, originally through an executive order, as we'll talk more about or have talked about. And then it became a full, with a congressional act, became a full department in 2003. Now here's your general undersecretary and administrative offices over here. So let's look at the third tier bureau down here. The TSA, Transportation Security Administration. If you've ever flown and had to go through an airport, I'm sure you're very well aware of what the TSA is responsible for. These agencies down here all have various immigration and customs enforcement and border protection functions down here. Former Border Patrol here. The U.S. Secret Service, one of the things it does is provide protection for government officials. The U.S. Coast Guard, of course, protects our coastlines. And then FEMA is the agency that's responsible for responding to disasters, whether man-made or natural. But FEMA is an important group that comes in to take care of coordination with the federal government and management of that disaster. The Department of Treasury, again, I've exploded the third tier bureau down here because we've got lots of offices, administrative departments up here. But let's look at the third tier bureaus, the agencies that actually provide the work, the services to the public. And you may have heard of a few of these: the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, and the United States Mints, which makes our money. Again, then gets sent over to the Federal Reserve, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. And famously, you probably have heard of the Internal Revenue Service that collects our taxes. And in fact, I just a couple of days ago did my income taxes, mail them off to the IRS. So these are the third tier bureaus of the Department of Treasury. The Department of Defense is over all three of the major military branches, as you can see over here. And it's also the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff that reports to the president there, that is also part of his National Security Council. But let's look at what you would call the third tier bureaus here in the Department of Defense. There they are down there. The National Security Agency, very much in the news over the past decade or more for its surveillance services to try to stop terror. It's also been kind of under the scrutiny of the federal courts as well, perhaps of going too far with their intelligence, invading privacy. They've had to restructure some of their activities. We also even have a Defense Intelligence Agency here, which was the center of the intelligence gathering for the Iraq War. This was when the inner circle of George Bush and Vice President Cheney decided to kind of go outside of the CIA in order to gather their own intelligence for the Iraq War. And there's an interesting story about this one right here, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, now just referred to as DARPA, sometimes just ARPA. But back in 1957, when the Soviets launched the Sputnik satellite into space, the United States virtually went into panic mode as to how they beat us up there. And so we started to really take it to the next step in trying to compete with the Soviets on this technology. And the DARPA agency was formed right after that. DARPA was tasked with trying to find new technological projects to compete with the Soviets, or to particularly to prepare us for potential Cold War threats. Now, DARPA discovered fairly quickly that our telephone communication system was very centralized. At that time, we pretty much had a regulated monopoly referred to as Ma Bell, and they discovered that the Soviets could potentially take out our telephone communication systems quite easily, since it was so centralized. So what they decided to do was start a project where computers, which were just now coming into prominence after World War II, to connect computers with a communication network. And by 1971, there's about 15 universities around the United States that were interconnected through their computers. And as you may have already surmised, that is the development of the internet. The internet came about as a result of that project, and then eventually it was federally subsidized to take public, so to speak, to create the internet, the World Wide Web as we now know it. So that's an interesting little piece of trivia there for one of these departments in the defense. As far as the Department of Labor, there's our third tier bureau down here, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. That's responsible for regulating clearly the safety and health of workers of various sectors of our economy, manufacturing, industrial businesses. And here's a very important source of information right here. The Bureau of Labor Statistics provides lots of statistics and information and data on our labor force and our economy. Let's look at, this one's also been cut off, but it's the Department of Agriculture. And here we have the third tier bureaus here. Farm Service Agency, we've got Forest Service, you may have heard of some of these, Food and Nutrition Service, Food Safety Inspection Service, Agriculture Research Service. We've got several third tier bureaus there responsible for coordinating, directing, regulating, assisting our agricultural system in America. Okay, so here's the question that I want you to respond to on the discussion forum in Moodle. We've just talked about the 15 cabinet level departments there. So here's a question for you to ponder. There's no right or wrong answer. This is a chance for us to brainstorm. So is there a sector of society that has grown or evolved to be important enough, in your view, to now have its own cabinet level department? For example, after 9/11, the threat of terrorism and the importance of trying to protect us from terrorism was important enough that the government eventually decided to have a cabinet level Department of Homeland Security. Now, again, I don't want you to necessarily just go to terrorism or defense, but put your brain to it there and see, is there a particular sector of society that may now deserve its own cabinet level department? Now, in the you want to post this in the Moodle discussion forum under the Chapter 7 video lecture on the executive branch, very prominently shown there during the week of March 20th. And so you click on the discussion forum and then make your response with the Department of what, and briefly why you think it might be needed or worth creating. Now, you'd want to view the rest of the video in its entirety before you jump to that question, because these next remaining slides may give you some more ideas on what could be a candidate for a new department in the cabinet. Now let's talk about independent agencies for a little bit. We've mentioned the CIA. It's independent for a reason. The CIA is tasked with gathering intelligence, and it really cannot be beholden to any particular agency. The defense may have its own reasons for collecting intelligence. The Navy may have its own different reasons. The Homeland Security may have other different priorities. The FBI may even be tugging on their ear for intelligence. So therefore, the CIA has to maintain somewhat of its autonomous, independent structure in order to get out there and do what it needs to do to gather intelligence. Now, clearly, that's gotten it in trouble several times over its history. Back in the 50s, the CIA was behind several coup attempts and a few successful coup attempts that where the United States interests were such that we did not want countries to shift their government to be anywhere close to communist leading, and we actually supported some pretty ruthless dictators in order to prevent countries from going communist. So that's been kind of a skeleton in our closet, so to speak. And then even more recently, after the 9/11, we really pushed hard, and we kind of gave agencies a little bit more free rein to do what they needed to do, and even quote unquote operate on the dark side, if you will. And the CIA had been kind of discovered to perhaps gone a little bit too far in its borderline torture techniques, its rendition, outsourcing interrogation techniques. And that a backlash did occur, and that kind of came back to bite us. Reports came out, and the CIA was admonished for perhaps going a little bit too overzealously, over a little bit too far. And a lot of that is human nature. When people are tasked to take care of a problem and given more and more free rein and independence, then they can potentially go too far. So that's one of the reasons why we have oversight in a democratic system, to hopefully rein something like that in if it gets too far. But the CIA has maintained its independent structure for a reason. Now, the EPA is also independent because it cannot be beholden to any other sector. If the agricultural sector has its own interests at heart, it say, well, we don't want the EPA to pursue this type of whether it's erosion from irrigation or something like that. The EPA has to remain independent in order to pursue the protections on our environment without being beholden or perhaps having a conflict of interest with other agencies who have other priorities. So as you see, there's kind of a consistent theme here as to why these are independent. NASA, perhaps kind of unique in its own way, it was established in order to beat the Soviets primarily in the race to the moon, and then the developing of the shuttle program after that, and then now it's kind of redefined its mission to get to Mars, perhaps by way of a base on the moon. The National Transportation Safety Board provides a good contrast to why it's independent as opposed to what we just talked about a few minutes ago, the National Highway Transportation and Safety Administration, NHTSA. That group is responsible for the rules and regulations, whereas the NTSB is more of an investigative arm than it is a regulatory arm, which is the NHTSA. So, for example, if the NTSB and the NHTSA were both under the same departments, well, the NHTSA may actually direct them to say, okay, now wait a minute, you don't want us to look bad here, so be careful with your investigation there, because you don't want to blame us because we should have caught that with our rules and regulations earlier. So therefore, that prevents a conflict of interest if the NTSB was actually working for the agency that it was actually investigating as a part of this particular accident. So that's another reason why they are independent. The U.S. Agency for International Development is tasked with determining where U.S. financial aid needs to go primarily to developing countries so that they can develop. And clearly, if the USAID was under the auspices of the Defense Department, well, then that money would be given for strategic reasons. If it was under the State Department, it would be given for strategic diplomatic reasons. So therefore, the U.S. aid is autonomous in trying to figure out where the money needs to go to the best place to help a country develop. So you can see some pretty much common themes here is why we have these independent agencies. Now let's look at the government corporations. These are agencies that are set up by the government to handle a business or a commercial activity. So theoretically, these government corporations generate their own revenue, and it may not always work out. The post office is probably the most famous example of a government corporation. Over the years, it's been able to finance itself through postage fees, handling fees, shipping fees, things like that. But because of the internet and people not using or not mailing letters as much as they used to, and so the post office has had ongoing financial difficulties for well over a decade or more, and has required the federal government to finance it. So it's operating in the red. There have been numerous proposals out there to try to cut spending on the post office, perhaps closing it on Saturdays, or perhaps even opening up the post office to serve kind of like a credit union as it's used in other countries. So that gives the post office another function to be able for people to use it as a place to save money and borrow money through credit unions. The Federal Reserve System, very important system that is tasked, and we'll talk about them in more detail when we talk about the financial part of our class. But the Federal Reserve, also referred to as the central bank, literally is the bank where all the reserves of all the member banks of the entire United States, where the reserves are kept. It also charges the banks fees for that. It earns interest on its loans to banks or the banks' loans with each other. And very important organization here that is responsible for controlling the money supply in our country. Very important part of economic policy that we'll talk about in more detail. And so because of the fact that they can take money printed by the Treasury and then use that money for supplying reserves or for buying and selling government bonds and securities, the Federal Reserve has quite often actually made a huge profit that it pays back to the federal government. Amtrak is another government corporation that's often in the news, more often than not negatively, because of an accident or the fact that it's often a target for government cutting as to why would the government pay for a rail transportation system. And but however, it has typically supported itself through a user paying system to where people pay to ride the Amtrak, even though it's a government built and government controlled operation. You pay for it just like you would any other typical rail system. And plus the government invests in it, hopefully to recoup that investment by serving as a vital mass commuter transit function. Now, the government-sponsored enterprises such as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they were set up primarily to provide low-interest loans for lower income Americans, primarily so that they could buy a house. And Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac got caught up in the subprime mortgage crisis, where they overextended themselves on the subprime mortgage lending. That came back to bite them. They have since somewhat recovered from that, and they are massively, I guess you could say, financed enterprises because of the fact that they are, very popular lending institutions that have the potential to be backed by the federal government, or at least that's the perception that they would be backed by the federal government, and that makes them a little bit more attractive options for loans. So those are some examples of government corporations. And then finally here we're looking at our regulatory commissions, and these are typically led by 3-person panels that are appointed by the president. So those 3-person panels vote on various regulations and rulings over any particular sector. Federal Trade Commission looks at any types of disputes over trade that somebody might have. Federal Election Commission is overseeing, even though each state is responsible for its own elections, the FEC is somewhat of an oversight, a federal oversight and regulatory arm for all the states to somewhat coordinate in some respects of their election systems. The Consumer Product Safety Commission that looks over, as you can see right there, the safety of our products. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission came into more prominence as to regulating the trading of stocks and other commodities, futures, and perhaps regulating our derivatives market, things like that, to try to reduce the potential for risk that blows up in our face and could potentially result in another recession, such as the one in 2008. And then the Occupational Safety, Health, and Review Commission is different from OSHA. OSHA is responsible for the oversight of the safety and health of the labor force. And then this is a review commission that looks at disputes and rulings. So again, somewhat independent and autonomous from the OSHA department, which is in the Department of Labor. All right, so that's a very broad overview of the executive branch. So don't forget to post your response to my question that I posed earlier. Again, go to the Moodle discussion forum for the Chapter 7 video lecture on the executive branch, and post your comment there, your response there about what we talked about earlier.